They didn't just bulldoze my farm. They erased every last inch of my life in a single afternoon. From the porch of my little farmhouse, I stood frozen as 3 yellow excavators tore into my green fields. The air was filled with the grinding roar of engines and the sickening crunch of wood and metal. My barn collapsed like it was made of paper. My fences, gone. My vegetable plots, flattened under giant steel tracks. And there she was. Karen. The HOA president. Standing there with her arms folded, big sunglasses hiding her eyes, but not the smug grin stretched across her face. She didn't yell. She didn't order anyone around. She didn't have to. They were here on her command. I wanted to scream, to run at the machines, but my legs felt like they'd been bolted to the floor. Dust burned my throat. It wasn't just dirt they were turning over, it was my years of work, my family's history, my way of life. When the lead excavator knocked over the water tank, a cold realization hit me like a brick. Without this farm, this entire HOA's supply chain was about to crumble. They didn't even know it yet, but soon, would be the only one controlling everything they needed to survive. The question was, would I use that power to help them, or make them pay? It wasn't always like this. A year before that day, my life was calm, almost quiet to the point of boredom. I had inherited the farm from my grandfather, who had always told me, a farm's not just dirt and crops, it's life. It feeds you and teaches you patience. My days were spent tending rows of corn, tomatoes, squash, and fruit trees. I raised chickens, goats, and a few cows. I wasn't rich, but I lived well, and I shared my produce freely with neighbors who needed help. The HOA was technically next door, fancy houses with perfect lawns and folks who didn't know the first thing about dirt under their nails. Still, I got along fine with most of them. They'd stop by the farm stand, smile politely, and pay for fresh eggs or a basket of peaches. But then came Karen. She'd moved in a few months earlier and immediately took over the HOA like it was her personal empire. She had rules for everything, what color your door could be, how many inches your grass could grow, even the types of flowers you could plant. She didn't like messy things. And in her eyes, my farm was messy. At first, she kept her distance. But I noticed her car slowing down when she passed, her eyes scanning my property like she was inspecting it. I didn't think much of it until she sent me a letter. It was on HOA letterhead, with her signature at the bottom. The letter stated that my activities were negatively affecting the appearance of the community, and that livestock and large-scale gardening were not in keeping with HOA standards. I laughed when I read it, because my farm wasn't even part of their community. The HOA had no legal power over me. I called her to explain just that. She didn't answer, but the next day, I found her at the local market, standing by the dairy cooler like she'd been waiting for me. "Your goats are loud," she said without even saying hello. "They're goats," I replied. "They make goat noises." "Well, they wake people up." She tilted her head, smiling like she was being polite. "Maybe you should relocate them." I told her no. Politely. Then she leaned in and said something I didn't quite understand at the time. "You might think you're outside the HOA, but everything's connected. Sooner or later, we'll make sure you fall in line." I thought it was an empty threat. For a few weeks, nothing happened. Then small problems started creeping up. A delivery truck bringing my farm supplies mysteriously got stopped at the HOA gate for hours. My customers from the community began telling me they'd been warned about health hazards on my farm. Even the local store hinted that they might stop buying my produce if the rumors kept circulating. It was petty, sure, but it was working. Sales dipped. Feed deliveries were late. I started noticing HOA board members driving past, taking photos. I tried to ignore it, thinking maybe it would blow over. I kept donating fresh vegetables to the local school, letting families come pick fruit for free, and hosting little farm tours for kids. People loved it. That's what gave me peace, knowing the farm wasn't just mine, it was part of the community in a bigger sense. Then, one morning in mid-spring, I woke to the distant sound of engines. Not tractors, bigger, heavier machines. My dog, Duke, barked frantically. I stepped outside and saw 3 bulldozers rolling toward my front gate, followed by a convoy of flatbed trucks carrying equipment. And behind them, a black SUV. Karen's SUV. I ran down the drive, waving my arms. "Hey! You can't be here!" I shouted. But they didn't stop. They drove straight through my wooden gate, splintering it like matchsticks. Karen stepped out of her SUV in heels like she was arriving at some grand opening. "We have permits," she said coolly, holding up a folder. "Your property is being cleared for community development. You'll be compensated." "What community?" I yelled. "This is my land." She smirked. "Not anymore." I knew right then this wasn't a mistake, it was an attack. The machines roared to life, chewing through my land like it was disposable. My crops went under in minutes. My barn, gone. The animals I'd moved to the far pasture scattered in fear. And that's when I noticed something no one else seemed to realize, those big underground pipes they were crushing. Those were the main irrigation lines that fed not just my farm, but the HOA's landscaping, gardens, and decorative fountains. They were destroying their own water supply without even knowing it. I stood there in the dust, heart pounding, and for the first time, I didn't just feel angry, I felt powerful. But that power came with a choice. And before I could even decide, something happened that turned the whole scene from bad to catastrophic. One of the bulldozers hit something deep in the ground. There was a deep metallic groan, followed by a sound like a giant exhaling. Then, a violent explosion of water and dirt shot 50 feet into the air. And everyone started screaming. The water geyser roared like a broken fire hydrant on steroids, drenching everyone in muddy spray. Karen shrieked as the water soaked her designer blouse and smeared her makeup, stumbling backward into the dirt. Workers scrambled to shut off the excavators, but it was too late, the damage had been done. A deep, rushing hiss came from underground, and I realized exactly what they'd hit. It wasn't just one of my irrigation lines. It was the main connection from the old well system. An ancient network my grandfather had maintained for decades. That system didn't just water my crops. It was the lifeline for half the HOA's lush green lawns, ornamental gardens, and that fancy artificial lake they bragged about in brochures. The water flooded fast, pooling at the bottom of the field and rolling toward the HOA's back road like a brown, churning river. And I stood there, drenched and stunned, as Karen turned toward me with an expression that was part panic, part fury. "What is this?" she demanded, water dripping from her chin. "You tell me," I replied calmly. "You're the one with the permits." She tried to keep up her confident act, barking orders to the crew, but the workers looked uneasy. One of them approached her and whispered something I couldn't hear, but I caught enough of her face to know it wasn't good news. That was my less extreme moment, because what came next made everything feel 10 times heavier. The HOA's maintenance supervisor arrived in a golf cart, skidding to a halt beside Karen. He was pale, already holding a clipboard. "They're calling from the lake," he said in a shaky voice. "The water's dropping, fast. Fountains are off. Lawns are already browning. Without that well," he trailed off, glancing at me, then back to her. "We can't sustain irrigation for more than a week." A week. That was all they had before their manicured paradise turned into a patchy, dying wasteland. And there I was, the only one who knew exactly how to fix it. Karen turned to me, her voice trembling. You can repair this, right?" I let the question hang in the air, pretending to think. In reality, I already knew my answer. But I wasn't about to give it away, not yet. Instead, I walked away without saying a word. Duke trotted beside me, dripping wet but still alert, as if he knew things had shifted in my favor. By the time I reached the farmhouse, I could hear the distant sound of HOA residents yelling in their yards, probably wondering why their sprinklers weren't working. And that's when my phone started buzzing, unknown numbers, one after another. I ignored them all. The next morning, I drove into town to pick up some feed for the animals that had fled the chaos. But the feed store owner, a kind older man named Bill, gave me a strange look when I walked in. "Son, you all right? Heard there was trouble on your land yesterday." I nodded slowly. "More than trouble." That's when he leaned closer and whispered, "Word is, the HOA's in panic mode. Karen's been calling around asking if anyone can help her fix some urgent infrastructure issue." He smirked. "Guess who everyone's telling her to call?" I smiled faintly but kept my mouth shut. I had no intention of answering her, not until I decided how far I wanted to take this. For 2 days, the HOA tried to patch things themselves. I could see them from my porch, contractors hauling in pumps, residents with hoses stretched awkwardly across yards, kids filling buckets from whatever water they could find. But nothing worked. The lake's waterline dropped lower and lower until it was just a muddy pit. Lawns started turning yellow. That lush image they clung to was falling apart before their eyes. Then came the next extreme event, the one that would make things truly spiral. On the third night, I was jolted awake by a loud crash outside. Duke barked fiercely, his deep growl echoing through the house. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped onto the porch just in time to see 2 shadowy figures sprinting across my yard toward the road. And behind them, in the dim beam of my light, I saw it. The gate to my pump house, busted open, and water valves freshly tampered with. Someone had just tried to steal my water. I ran toward the pump house, the beam of my flashlight shaking with every step. The door hung off its hinges, and the padlock lay in the dirt, snapped clean in two. Inside, the metal valves were dripping, and the control panel's cover had been pried open with what looked like a crowbar. Whoever it was, they'd been seconds away from diverting the flow straight toward the HOA's pipelines. Duke was still barking, chasing their scent down the road, but I whistled him back. "Leave it," I muttered, scanning the ground. Fresh muddy footprints led away from the pump house toward the main road, the same road that led straight into HOA territory. I stood there for a moment, listening. The only sounds were the faint drip of water and the distant hum of crickets. But my chest burned with anger. This wasn't just some random act. This was desperate, calculated. And I had a pretty good guess whose idea it was. The less extreme part came in the morning, when I decided not to call the sheriff right away. Not because I didn't want justice, but because I wanted to see just how far they'd go. I spent the day reinforcing the pump house. I replaced the lock with a heavy-duty industrial one, added metal bars over the panel, and even put up a few motion-activated lights. My neighbor, old Mr. Thompson, stopped by in his truck and leaned out the window. "Everything all right?" he asked, eyeing the repairs. "Just making sure my water doesn't walk away in the middle of the night," I said. He chuckled dryly. "Heard Karen's been throwing tantrums in the HOA meetings. They can't keep the golf course green. Half their residents are mad enough to eat her alive." That made me smirk, but inside I knew this was getting dangerous. Desperation made people reckless, and I had just seen a taste of it the night before. Sure enough, by the afternoon, my phone lit up with another unknown number. This time, I answered. "Hello?" There was a pause, then Karen's voice, sugary but strained. "We seem to have gotten off on the wrong foot." "I don't think a bulldozer counts as a wrong foot," I said flatly. She laughed nervously. "Look, the community is in crisis. Lawns are dying, the lake is gone, the fountains aren't working." "Sounds rough," I cut in. "I'm willing to negotiate," she said slowly. "If you'd agree to share your water again, we could come to some sort of arrangement." I let the silence drag until she finally spoke again. "What do you want?" That was the moment I realized I could ask for almost anything. But I didn't give her an answer, not yet. "I'll think about it," I said, then hung up. That night, I sat on the porch with Duke, staring out at the moonlit fields. I thought about my grandfather's words, about kindness and community, about how power could be used to protect or to punish. But every time I remembered the sight of my barn collapsing under those bulldozers, my chest tightened. I didn't get much time to think before the next extreme event slammed into my world. Just before dawn, Duke's furious barking woke me again. But this time, it wasn't footsteps in the yard. It was flames. A section of my west field was on fire, bright orange against the dark sky, and the wind was pushing it toward the barn. The heat hit me before I even reached the field. The fire crackled like it was alive, snapping and devouring the dry grass in long, hungry gulps. Smoke burned my eyes and coated my throat with a bitter taste. Duke ran ahead, barking frantically at the flames as if he could scare them away. I grabbed the hose by the barn and yanked it toward the blaze, but the pressure sputtered weakly, nowhere near strong enough to fight the fire on its own. The dry season had already been stretching my reserves thin, and the well couldn't keep up with a blaze this size. My heart pounded harder than it had the night the bulldozers came. I sprinted to my truck, jumped in, and tore down the dirt road to wake up my nearest neighbors. Old Mr. Thompson grabbed 2 fire extinguishers from his garage, and his grandson hopped on an ATV with buckets of water. Within minutes, we had a small crew working side by side, stamping and soaking the edges of the fire to stop it from spreading. It took almost an hour, but we finally got it under control. The west field was scorched black in a jagged half-moon, the smell of smoke heavy in the air. My barn was safe, but my nerves were shot. Once the adrenaline wore off, I stood in the middle of the charred ground, my boots sinking into the soft ash. This wasn't an accident. The wind had carried embers in one direction only, straight from the road leading to the HOA. The less extreme moment came later that morning, when I called the county fire marshal to report the blaze. He came out, took a few photos, and shook his head. "Looks like it started with accelerant," he said. "Probably gasoline. Could have been a tossed match or someone lighting it on purpose." I didn't need to hear the rest. The unspoken part was obvious: we were dealing with arson. I decided to play it quiet. No public accusations, no open war, at least not yet. If Karen or her people thought I was going to panic, they were in for a surprise. Instead, I started making calls to a few contacts my grandfather had introduced me to years ago, people in supply, in agriculture, even in trucking. People who owed me favors. By that afternoon, I had 3 different offers to buy up bulk goods, feed, fertilizer, even water tanks, that the HOA might need if their problems kept growing. I didn't commit to anything yet, but the idea was forming: if I could control the supply chain they relied on, I could decide their future. And just when I thought I had time to work my plan in secret, the next extreme event came crashing through my front gate. Literally. Late that evening, as I was locking up the pump house, the roar of an engine came from the road. Before I could react, a black pickup barreled down my driveway, smashed through my wooden gate, and skidded to a stop in front of my porch. 2 men I'd never seen before jumped out, one with a clipboard, the other carrying a crowbar. "We're here for an inspection," the one with the clipboard said, grinning like it was a joke. But I knew this wasn't an inspection. This was intimidation. The man with the clipboard took a slow step forward, eyes sweeping across my property like he owned it. The other one twirled the crowbar in his hand, not saying a word, just letting the metal catch the porch light in a way that made his intentions clear. "Inspection for what?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. Duke growled low beside me, his fur bristling. HOA property compliance, the clipboard man said, his smirk growing. We've received reports that your water system is creating a safety hazard for nearby residents. If we find any violations, we can shut it down. I almost laughed. You can't shut down what you don't control. The crowbar man stepped closer, tapping the metal against his palm. We can make life harder for you. It was obvious, they weren't here to find violations. They were here to scare me into opening the valves and letting that water flow back into their dying lawns and empty lake. The less extreme moment came when I decided to handle it my way. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I simply pulled out my phone and began recording. You're trespassing, I said loudly enough for the microphone to catch every word. Leave now, or I call the sheriff. They froze for a second, glancing at each other. The crowbar man muttered something under his breath, then they both turned and climbed back into the truck. As they reversed down my driveway, I made sure to keep the camera rolling until they were gone. Later, I sent the video to a friend in the county sheriff's office, just in case. He promised to keep an eye out for them. But if they thought I was just going to sit around waiting for the next stunt, they were wrong. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a map of the county spread out in front of me. Every pipeline, every supply route, every distribution center within 50 miles, I marked them all. I wasn't just thinking about my water anymore. I was thinking about fuel, food, and equipment. The HOA had made themselves dependent on outside resources for everything. And I was starting to see exactly how to close every tap they relied on. I was deep in my notes when I heard Duke start barking again, sharp, frantic barks that meant trouble. I grabbed my flashlight and rushed to the door. That's when I saw it. Across the field, in the moonlight, a massive shape was moving toward my pump house. Not a person. Not a vehicle. It was a bulldozer. And it was rolling straight for my well. The bulldozer's engine roared like an angry beast, its headlights cutting two blazing cones through the night. Whoever was driving wasn't slowing down. They were aiming for the pump house with the same blind rage that had leveled my barn months ago. I sprinted toward it, flashlight beam bouncing wildly, shouting for them to stop. Duke bolted ahead, barking so loud it cut through the engine noise. But the driver didn't even flinch. If anything, they pushed harder on the throttle. The crunch of tires on gravel told me something else. There was more than one vehicle. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a white SUV idling on the road. And even through the glare of its lights, I recognized the silhouette in the driver's seat. Karen. Adrenaline hit me like a jolt of lightning. I ran to the pump house, yanked open the side panel, and twisted the manual override on the main valve, sealing it shut completely. If they wanted my water, they'd have to take the whole pump system intact. And I wasn't about to let that happen. By the time the bulldozer reached the fence around the pump house, I was already climbing onto it from the side. The driver, some guy in a ski mask, yelled in surprise, swerving. The machine's blade clipped one of the support beams but didn't hit the main structure. I swung the flashlight hard into the cab window, shattering it. You picked the wrong night. I shouted. He cursed and threw the bulldozer into reverse, but by then Duke was right at the front, barking like mad. The less extreme part came in the form of backup, because suddenly, headlights flared on all around us. My neighbors. Mr. Thompson's old Ford truck, Bill from the feed store in his flatbed, even a couple of townsfolk I barely knew. They'd seen the lights and heard the noise from miles away. They formed a semicircle around the road, blocking the SUV from leaving. Karen's face was pale in the glow of a dozen high beams, her smug expression gone completely. I jumped down from the bulldozer, breathing hard. This ends now, I said loud enough for everyone to hear. You come after my land again, you don't just lose your water, you lose every supplier, every truck, every delivery route you depend on. One of the men from town stepped forward. Already spoke to the co-op. You're cut off, Karen. No feed, no fertilizer, no landscaping services. Nobody's willing to deal with you after tonight. The look on her face was worth every sleepless night I'd endured. She glanced around at the wall of vehicles, the angry neighbors, the driver in the bulldozer now frozen in place. She wasn't in control anymore. That's when I turned back to my pump house, walked over, and flipped the emergency cutoff on the entire system. The hum of the pipes faded into silence. No water flows until I decide it does, I said. And you're going to learn what that means. For the first time, Karen didn't have a comeback. She just sat there, gripping the wheel, eyes darting like a trapped animal. Word spread fast after that night. By morning, every household in the HOA knew the truth: their pristine lawns, their golf course, their fountains, everything depended on me. And now, I controlled it all. Some tried to negotiate. Some tried to threaten. None succeeded. Because the simple fact was, I had what they needed to survive, and they had burned every bridge they could have crossed to get it back. But here's the thing, I didn't starve them. I didn't let their kids go without water. I set rules. Rules about respect, about fairness, about giving back to the community they'd tried to shut me out of. If they wanted my resources, they had to pitch in for school gardens, fund food drives, and stop the petty harassment of anyone who lived differently from them. It didn't happen overnight, but little by little, they changed. Not because they wanted to, but because they had to. And sometimes, that's the only way people like Karen ever learn. The HOA president who once bulldozed my farm now had to call me every month to request her community's water schedule. And every time she did, I made sure to remind her of the night she tried to destroy me, and ended up putting me in control of everything she needed to keep her kingdom alive. And I'll be honest, sometimes, when I hear the sprinklers start up over there, I can't help but smile. Because that's the sound of a lesson learned.